The prayer was not loud. It did not rise on smoke or blood or desperate promise. It was spoken once clearly and then never repeated. That was why Athena heard it. The mortal stood alone at the edge of a quiet city where the land sloped gently toward the sea. Behind them, the streets were already dark. Ahead, the water reflected the night without movement. They did not kneel. They did not raise their hands. They spoke as one speaks when they do not expect an answer. I need to know what must be done. The words were simple. They carried no demand. No bargain followed. No vow was offered in exchange for wisdom. The mortal waited only long enough to be certain they had been heard. Then they turned and went home. Athena did not respond. She heard the question as clearly as she had ever heard any. It reached Olympus without strain, without distortion, without fear. That was unusual. Most prayers arrived wrapped in urgency. This one arrived complete. Athena paused mid-thought, not because the question was difficult, because the answer was. She could have given it at once. She knew exactly what the mortal should do. She knew the path and the cost and the outcome. She also knew what would be lost if the answer came too soon. So she remained silent. Below, the mortal slept. Above, the goddess considered. Days passed. The city continued as cities always do. Markets opened. Ships departed. Arguments rose and settled again. The mortal continued their life without sign or confirmation. They did not speak the question again. That too did not go unnoticed. Athena watched. Not closely. Wisdom did not require constant attention. But she did not forget. On the seventh night, the mortal returned to the same place by the sea. They did not pray. They stood and waited. The night answered with nothing. Athena still said nothing. This was the moment when most mortals would have changed the question, or begged, or asked another god. This one did not. They returned home with the same quiet step with which they had arrived. Athena turned away from the edge of Olympus. She did not smile. She did not regret her silence, but she understood what she had begun. Some answers reshape a life. Others reshape a soul by not being given. And once withheld, they cannot be reclaimed. The silence did not feel heavy at first. It felt temporary. The mortal rose each morning expecting clarity to have arrived during sleep. It had not. They went about their days as they always had. They measured grain. They listened to disputes. They recorded the arrival and departure of ships. They did all of this with care. But beneath every task the question remained. What must be done? Athena watched from a distance. She did not avert her gaze. She simply did not intervene. The mortal did not grow angry. They did not grow fearful. They grew attentive. They noticed things they had once passed without thought. A merchant who delayed a decision until it was too late. A sailor who trusted an omen more than his own judgment. A magistrate who spoke wisely but acted too slowly. Each moment passed without instruction. Each moment asked to be understood. On the 10th day, the mortal returned to the place by the sea. They did not pray. They did not speak. They stood until the chill of night settled into the stone beneath their feet. Then they left. Athena noticed. Most prayers returned louder when unanswered. This one returned unchanged. Weeks passed. The city shifted subtly. A trade route faltered. A council postponed a necessary decision. Small things. But Athena knew small things were never small. The mortal began to feel the weight of delay. Not as fear, as responsibility. One evening, as they worked late recording names by lamplight, they paused. The flame wavered. Not from wind. From uncertainty. They set the stylus down. "What if I choose wrong?" they said aloud. No one answered. The words remained hanging in the quiet. Athena heard them. She did not respond, because the mortal had asked the wrong question, and she was waiting for the right one to form. The moment arrived without warning. It did not announce itself as consequence. It arrived as necessity. A ship returned early one afternoon, its sails torn, its hull damaged beyond quick repair. The harbor gathered around it. Voices rose. Questions followed. Cargo was missing. Not stolen. Lost. A storm far from shore had forced a decision. The captain had chosen to save the crew instead of the goods. The city now faced a shortage. Grain would run thin. Prices would rise. The council convened. The mortal was present as they always were. They recorded names. They recorded votes. They recorded delay. No one wished to decide first. Every option carried cost. The mortal felt it then. Not fear. The pressure of waiting too long. Athena watched. This was the kind of moment answers were meant for, and the kind of moment where giving one could undo everything. The mortal stylus paused above the wax tablet. They looked up. "This cannot wait," they said. The room quieted. Not because of authority, because of clarity. "We will lose more by waiting than by choosing," the mortal continued. Voices stirred. Arguments formed. But something had shifted. A decision had entered the room. The mortal did not claim to know the outcome. They did not invoke the gods. They spoke only of responsibility. Athena leaned forward slightly from her seat on Olympus. This was the moment she had waited for. Not the moment to answer. The moment to observe what silence would do. The council acted. Not perfectly. Not without disagreement. But decisively. The city moved. Outside, the evening settled. The mortal returned home later than usual. They stood once more by the sea. They did not pray. They did not ask again. They spoke quietly.
Il chose.
Athena heard them, and for the first time since the question was asked, she felt the cost of remaining silent. Athena did not regret her silence. Regret was not part of wisdom, but she examined it. From the heights of Olympus, she watched the city below not as a collection of people, but as a pattern slowly revealing itself. The mortal's decision had altered nothing immediately. There was no disaster.
No triumph.
Only motion where there had been waiting. This mattered. Wisdom was not proven by outcomes. It was proven by willingness to act without certainty. Athena had learned this long ago. She remembered her own beginnings, not as a child, as an idea, fully formed yet untested, born of knowledge but required to learn how knowledge moved among those who feared it. Mortals often believed wisdom meant answers. Athena knew better. Answers ended questions. Questions shaped minds. She turned her attention to the mortal again. They did not walk differently. They did not speak more boldly. They returned to their tasks with the same care they always had. But something subtle had changed. They no longer waited for permission. They weighed. They chose. And then they accepted what followed. Athena felt the pull to speak. It would be easy to whisper reassurance, to confirm that the choice had been sound. She resisted, not out of cruelty, out of care. An answer now would undo the lesson forming quietly within them. Below, the city adjusted. Trade routes shifted. Stores were rationed. Not harshly, carefully. There was tension, but there was also trust. The mortal became a point of reference, not because they were wise, because they were willing to decide. Athena observed this with measured distance. She had seen heroes rise quickly and collapse under certainty. She had seen kings destroy cities with perfect knowledge applied too soon. Silence was sometimes the most demanding guidance, and so Athena remained silent, not because the mortal had failed, because they had begun. Athena remembered another night, long ago, before this city, before this mortal. A different prayer had reached her then, louder, sharper, urgent with fear. She had answered quickly, too quickly. She remembered the man who had asked, a ruler, young, certain that wisdom would steady his hand. She had given him an answer, clear, accurate. He had followed it precisely, and in doing so, he had destroyed what he meant to save. Athena had watched the aftermath unfold, the certainty, the justification, the quiet refusal to question himself again. She had learned then that knowledge does not teach restraint. Silence sometimes does. Now, as she watched the mortal below, she felt the echo of that older choice. This time, she did not speak, not because the answer was unclear, but because the cost of clarity was. The decision did not end when it was made. It continued. That was the part the mortal had not expected. Each morning brought another moment that required choice. How much grain to release? Which ships to delay? Which voices to trust when agreement fractured? The mortal did not feel wiser. They felt responsible. And responsibility did not fade with sleep. They began rising earlier. Not from urgency, from habit. They listened longer before speaking. They learned which silences mattered and which only delayed. Athena watched this carefully. Wisdom did not grow in moments of certainty. It grew in sustained attention. Weeks passed. The city adjusted slowly. Some blamed the mortal, quietly. Others sought their counsel without calling it that. The mortal accepted this without satisfaction. They did not enjoy deciding. They endured it. One evening, as the city rested uneasily, the mortal sat alone with unfinished records spread before them. The lamplight flickered. Again, not from wind, from fatigue. They closed their eyes. For the first time since the question was asked, they spoke it again. Not aloud, not upward, only inward. What must be done? Athena felt it immediately, not as prayer, as burden. She turned away from the gathering of gods. This moment was not for spectacle. The mortal did not receive an answer, but they received something else. Clarity, not about outcomes, about obligation. They opened their eyes. They made another mark upon the tablet. Another decision entered the world. Athena remained silent, because now the silence was working. The city endured. That was what most noticed. What fewer noticed was how thin endurance can become before it breaks. A second ship failed to arrive. Then a third. The sea remained calm, but the roots beyond it did not. Storms gathered where none were expected. Merchants grew cautious. Delay returned where momentum had once taken hold. The mortal felt it immediately. The weight had changed. It was no longer the weight of choosing. It was the weight of consequence. Voices rose again in the council hall, not in argument, in uncertainty. Every decision now seemed to echo more loudly than before. The mortal listened. They measured. They hesitated. And in that hesitation, Athena felt something shift. Not doubt. Fear. This was the edge. The place where silence could begin to wound. Athena rose from her seat. Not to speak. To consider. She had withheld the answer so the mortal would learn to choose. But wisdom did not mean abandonment. She watched the mortal closely. They stood alone after the council dispersed. The hall emptied. The lamps dimmed. The mortal remained. Their hands rested on the cool stone table. For a long moment they did nothing. Then they spoke. "If I am wrong," they said quietly, "then let it be my fault." The words were not a plea. They were a claim. Athena felt the weight of them. This was not dependence. This was ownership. The mortal gathered the tablets. They left the hall. They did not return to the sea that night. They went instead to the granaries. They spoke with the keepers. They changed the plan. Not dramatically, not rashly, but decisively. The city felt it the next day. Supplies moved. Routes reopened. Some were angered, others relieved. The balance shifted again. Athena watched. Her hand hovered over the place where answers were given. She did not speak, but now the silence had changed. It was no longer absence. It was restraint. And restraint was also wisdom. The city entered a second season of uncertainty. Not crisis, not collapse. A slower kind of difficulty. One decision led to another, then another still. There was no single moment to point to and say, "This is where it changed." The mortal felt this accumulation deeply. Each choice carried memory now. Each outcome shaped the next. They began to see how easily dependence forms when answers arrive too quickly. Others came to them quietly. Not for commands, for confirmation. The mortal did not give it. They asked questions instead. Athena watched this with careful attention. This was not imitation. This was inheritance. The city was learning how to hold uncertainty without surrendering to it. That lesson could not be spoken. Change did not arrive as triumph. It arrived as quiet competence. The city did not celebrate. It adjusted. Markets reopened with fewer voices raised. Ships departed with clearer instruction. Arguments still occurred, but they did not linger. The mortal noticed this only slowly. They were too busy continuing. Each decision led to another. Each solution revealed a new problem. And yet the weight no longer pressed as sharply as before. Something had shifted inside them. They no longer asked what must be done before acting. They acted and then asked whether it had been right. Athena watched this carefully. This was the difference between seeking wisdom and becoming capable of it. The mortal no longer waited for certainty. They waited for understanding. One evening, as the city settled into rest, the mortal returned to the place by the sea. Not to pray, to think. The water was calm. The horizon indistinct. They stood there for a long while without speaking. For the first time since the question had been asked, they felt no urge to repeat it. This surprised them. They searched for the question and found only memory. Athena felt this too. It unsettled her more than desperation ever had. Silence was no longer teaching. It was nearing its end. The mortal turned away from the water. They did not look upward. They did not expect an answer now. They returned home and slept deeply without dreams. Athena remained awake. She had watched many mortals learn. Few had learned without instruction. Fewer still had learned because of restraint, and fewer than that had reached the moment when silence itself must decide whether to remain. Athena had always known when to speak. That was her gift. But knowing when not to speak was rarer. She walked the quiet paths of Olympus while the other gods slept or argued or dreamed. She did not join them. This decision was not theirs. She replayed the moment the prayer had reached her, not because it was unclear, because it had been complete. The mortal had not asked for success. They had not asked to be spared difficulty. They had asked to know what must be done. Athena knew now why she had remained silent. The answer would have replaced judgment. It would have shaped action before understanding formed. Mortals who received answers too soon mistook certainty for wisdom, and certainty was fragile. Below, the mortal slept. Their dreams were quiet now. No questions echoed through them. No futures demanded attention. They rested because they trusted themselves to act when waking came. Athena felt the pull again, the ancient instinct to clarify, to conclude, to confirm. She could still speak. The answer remained perfectly formed. But if she spoke now, she would take something back. Not knowledge, ownership. The mortal would remember the answer, but they would forget how they had learned to decide without it. Athena stopped. She stood at the edge of Olympus and looked down. The city was calm, not prosperous, not secure, but functioning. Lives continued. Mistakes were made. They were corrected. This was not failure. This was growth. Athena exhaled. Not relief. Acceptance. Some answers were meant to be lived into, not delivered. And once withheld long enough, they ceased to be answers at all. They became understanding. Athena turned away. She did not descend. She did not send a sign. She allowed the silence to remain. For one more night. The moment did not arrive with ceremony. It came as mornings often do. Light touched the city without announcement. The mortal rose as they had for many days now. They washed. They dressed. They reviewed the records set aside the night before. There was no weight pressing on their chest. No question waiting to be asked. Only the day to be met. At the council hall voices gathered. Decisions were required. The mortal listened. They spoke. They acted. And as they did, they noticed something. They were not searching for the right choice. They were making one. Athena felt it at once. The moment she had been waiting for. Not failure. Not success. Completion. The mortal paused briefly mid-task. Not in doubt. In recognition. They felt it settle quietly inside them. The understanding they had once sought was already present. Not as instruction. As confidence. That evening they returned to the place by the sea. Not out of habit. Out of gratitude. They stood in silence and watched the water move as it always had. They did not speak. They did not ask. They knew now what must be done. Not tomorrow. Not forever. Only when the moment required it. Athena stood above and felt the thread between them loosen. Not break. Release. She had withheld the answer until it was no longer needed. And now there was nothing left to give. The mortal turned away from the sea. They returned home and slept deeply. Athena did not speak that night. She did not need to. The silence had finished its work. Nothing remarkable followed. And that was the point. The days that came next did not announce themselves as different. The city continued to move, to trade, to argue, to repair what had been strained. The mortal continued their work. They listened. They decided. They accepted what followed. No voice descended from Olympus. No sign appeared in the sky or the sea or the dreams of the night. And yet something had settled. The mortal no longer searched for certainty. They no longer waited for permission. They trusted the careful balance between knowing and choosing. Athena watched for a time. Not closely. Not distantly. As one watches something that has reached its natural form. She did not feel loss. She felt completion. Wisdom had not been given. It had been grown. The silence had done what speech could not. Above, Olympus returned to its endless rhythm. Below, the city endured not because it had been spared difficulty, but because it had learned how to meet it. The mortal returned once more to the place by the sea. Not to ask. Not to wait. Only to stand and breathe and allow the night to move as it wished. They did not look upward. They did not need to. Somewhere far above Athena turned away from the edge of the world. The answer she had withheld was no longer an answer. It had become understanding. And understanding did not need a voice. The night continued. The sea remained. The city slept. And the silence that once held a question now held something gentler. A quiet certainty that when the moment comes the choice will be made. And that will be enough. Years passed. Not loudly. Not in moments that demanded notice. They passed as time often does when no one is counting. The city changed. Slowly. Leadership shifted. New voices entered the council. Old ones stepped aside. The mortal remained for a while and then they did not. Not because they left. Because they became ordinary again. The city no longer spoke of the one who had asked Athena. They spoke of procedures, of habits, of decisions that were made without ceremony. And Athena watched. She saw new mortals stand by the sea. She heard prayers that carried urgency and fear and desperation. She answered some. She withheld others, but never again in quite the same way, because this silence had taught her something too. Wisdom did not always need a moment. Sometimes it needed a generation. The mortal who had once waited now lived quietly. They were not consulted as often. They did not mind. They had not asked to be remembered. They had asked to know what must be done. And that knowledge had stayed with them long after the question had dissolved. Sometimes they still walked by the sea, not to listen, not to ask, only to stand and let the night move as it wished. Athena never spoke to them. She never needed to. The space where the answer had once been was now filled with something steadier. Judgment. In time the story lost its edges. Not because it was forgotten. Because it no longer needed to be told clearly. It became a pattern instead of a lesson. A way decisions were approached. A pause before certainty. Athena observed this with quiet satisfaction. Not pride. Completion. She did not mark the moment as success. She marked it as sufficient. The gods continued their endless concerns. Wars rose. Wars ended. Cities flourished. Cities fell. And still somewhere a mortal would hesitate before asking the gods. Not out of doubt. Out of trust in their own judgment. Athena felt this ripple far more deeply than any prayer. This was the inheritance of silence. Not confusion. Not fear. But space. Space for understanding to form without instruction. On quiet nights Athena would return to the edge of Olympus. She would look down not searching for the mortal who had asked. They were no longer important. What mattered was that the question no longer needed to be spoken. The night would move forward. The sea would remain. Choices would be made. And silence once heavy with expectation now rested easily between moments. Not empty. Complete.